G'day, Mate 40 here. So perhaps the biggest difference between this channel and mainstream news commentary and other live streamers and pundits is that I recognize and respect that values and morality operate in a constellation, and each constellation is set by one's hero system. So in most punditry, it's taken for granted that there exists something called freedom or decency that's just objective. When in reality, what you consider freedom and what you consider decency depends on the exact nature of your hero system. And so Mark Leibovich is an excellent reporter for the New York Times, for the Atlantic, author of some great books on Washington, D.C., on Republicans under Donald Trump, on the NFL. He is excellent at piercing the polite things that people say and get to the essence of what's really going on. And he has a fun read in the Atlantic, in the October issue of the Atlantic, about how Republicans are ridiculous in the way that they humble themselves before Donald Trump, and how servile they act before Donald Trump, and how Donald Trump revels in humiliating people. And it's absolutely true. But what he doesn't consider is that there are other values at play. All right? So let's say that there's legislation that you want to pass, or there's a tone you want to set, or you want to have an influence on appointees, whether judicial or bureaucratic, right? It helps, right? You can have more real-world influence if you play to Donald Trump and you're a Republican, right? There are other values in life aside from saying what you feel, saying what you believe to be true. There are other values in life aside from not flattering people or not being a toady. Right? If by flattering Donald Trump and toadying to Donald Trump and behaving in a servile way to Donald Trump, you get to further other values that are important to you, such as perhaps the United States Supreme Court Justice, or you get influence on an important appointee, or you get the president's attention with regard to some other part of your agenda, right? You may be sacrificing, right, your own code of conduct, right? I've got a code of conduct for this YouTube channel, but I recognize the code of conduct operates within a galaxy of competing values, and that some things are acceptable if they're really funny, right? If there's a huge humor payoff, right? I'm going to put up with behavior that I wouldn't put up with if it wasn't funny. And so flattering people and toadying up to people and behaving in a servile way is none of our ideas of a good life. But sometimes it's essential. Let's say you have a good job, you like 80% of your job. It's just that 20% of your job, right, you have to behave in a way, or you have to put up with things that are uncomfortable for you, right? You weigh the good with the bad, and then you make your decision. So Mark Leibovich finds it incredible that Republicans can consider themselves the law and order party and at the same time support Donald Trump, who played a role in the January 6th riots, and he is a convicted felon. But that Donald Trump is a convicted felon and that he played a role in the January 6th riots, right, does not discredit an overall Republican commitment to law and order. Right? These things operate within a galaxy, a spectrum, a universe. So compare Republicans to Democrats on the death penalty for murder. Right? Overwhelmingly, Republicans are far more likely to support the death penalty for murder and to nominate judges who support the death penalty for murder, and will be tougher on criminal violence than Democrats, even if there are inconsistencies. Right? Republicans, whatever their inconsistencies, have been tougher on Donald Trump on immigration, both legal and illegal immigration. They severely reduced refugee intake, and we see the consequences of electing a Democratic president, right, with a massive surge of immigration and refugee intake. So we have one town in the Midwest in particular that's struggling with the importation of 2,000 Haitians, which have completely disrupted life in that small town. Right? That would not have happened if Donald Trump had been president. So even though much of Donald Trump's behavior is embarrassing, and many of the things he says are wrong, don't make sense, are flat out lies, right? You get a binary choice, right? It's either Trump or Harris. And if you're a Republican politician, right, you can either contribute to the team or be a distraction to your team. Sometimes telling the truth can be a distraction to your team. And there are times when it's more important to be a good team player than to tell the truth. And there are other times where it's more important to tell the truth than to be a good team player. It's not as though there's one outstanding, transcendent black and white rule. It's not one transcendent moral value that just always, in all contexts, outweighs all other moral values. For example, it's a great value to spend time with friends on a day off. But we have had a week of 100-degree temperatures in Los Angeles. A week of very hot temperatures. And so yesterday, after I did my 4-hour live stream, right, I stayed in with the beautiful air conditioning. And I subscribed to NFL Red Zone. And I had a couple of excellent Audible books. One by Rob Copeland on Ray Dalio, and then another on James Mercer and the Magellan Fund. And so much fun to listen to these Audible books, like sterling works of nonfiction on hedge funds. And just kick back, watch NFL Red Zone, and then do various exercises. So I'm lucky, I'm 58 years of age, and almost nothing in my body hurts on an ongoing basis. But I do have to watch out for two things. All right, I can get instability in my lower back if I'm not maintaining my core. So if I'm not doing planks and related exercises to maintain my core, all right, I'm going to get lower back instability, which can completely take me down. So the day off and not going out, not seeing friends, just spending it in, right? I got to do my planks, got to do all sorts of exercises, and then I've got some mild golfer's elbow in my left elbow. And so there are exercises that I'm doing to combat that. And so, yeah, ideally I spend time off with friends, but it was so stinking hot yesterday that I went with competing values of staying cool, comfortable, and taking care of things that otherwise not being properly addressed. And spending time with friends is great, beautiful value. But there were 2 months this year where something like February, March approximately, where I was working 60 hours a week. And I was absolutely absorbed in this project. Right? I just wanted to spend every spare minute on this project I was working on. And I was paid well for it. I was intellectually, just my whole self was absorbed in this project. I was happy to think about it when I wasn't working. Right? Sometimes I'd even do research or contemplation about the project off the clock because it was just so interesting to me. And I wasn't doing a lot of socializing during this time. I had my Jewish commitments and my 12-step commitments. And aside from that, I was just working and getting in an appropriate amount of exercise. And I mean, as a guy, to be good at something, right? My work was appreciated. Right? I was good at what I was doing. I was getting better at what I was doing. I was building my skills, and I was just completely absorbed in this project. And that's a wonderful thing, man. Right? If you got work that absorbs you, that excites you, and you just devote yourself to it, I mean, that's fantastic. And yeah, that will mean less socializing. So I've been reading a bunch of Atlantic magazine articles on friendship in America, how we're spending considerably less time with friends. And of course, that's overall a bad thing. And they don't address a prime factor behind this, and that is an increasingly diverse America means that we have less in common. For example, half the people in Los Angeles can't speak English, right? How am I going to form friendships with people who don't speak English when I don't really care to speak Spanish? But one thing I appreciate about Orthodox Judaism, I think really hits a need for me, is that it's a high intensity religion, and I grew up in a high intensity religion. So if you didn't grow up in religion in all likelihood is going to seem strange. But I grew up in a high intensity insular religion, Seventh-day Adventism, and then I vibrated with the high intensity commitment of Orthodox Judaism. And one of the side benefits of participating in a high intensity religion is that it's highly unlikely, if you're in sync with what's going on, that you will feel lonely. Right? In Orthodox Judaism, there are prayers 3 times a day, there's Torah study, there are simchas, meaning joyous occasions, where people celebrate births, they mourn together for deaths, they celebrate weddings, celebrate holidays. Right? If you get a raise at work, if you get a new job, a new position, open a new business, right? Typical way to observe that in Orthodox Judaism is that you sponsor a kiddush, right? You have a communal meal with other people in your community. Now, some people aren't cut out for this. So whenever Jews have had a choice, most have chosen not to be Orthodox Jews. But if this is a fit for your personality and for your situation, then the great benefit of participating in this way of life is that you will not be lonely in all likelihood. Right? And if you are lonely, it's because you have some kind of addiction going on, and there are ways to address that. So I got into a phase a couple of weeks ago where every night, once I put my head on my pillow, I was just evolving intricate, detailed male equivalents of 50 Shades of Grey in my head. Right? I was spending an hour or 2 a night in lust. And this wasn't serving me, and this didn't make me happy, because I've in my waking hours, right, I don't spend that much time in lust. Right? I have a really busy life, busy schedule, things to do, people to see, books to read, shows to prepare, shows to edit, exercises, movies I want to see. But when I was putting my head on the pillow, I was just getting filled with lust, and it was taking longer for me to get to sleep, and it just wasn't putting me in a good place. And the way I addressed it was the way that I knew how to address it, and that was just to spend more face time with other people. Right? So many of my problems become considerably diminished if I just spend more face time with other people who I like and who I respect. Now, I came to Los Angeles at age 27, and up until about age 40, I felt largely in sync with my peers. But by age 40, My peers had become doctors and lawyers, started their own businesses, or executives, had flourishing careers, and were married, and were having kids, and had mortgages. And it's a lot harder to make appointments with friends who are married with kids, because all sorts of things come up, and you might want to go do something together, and there's probably a 50% chance that something will come up, and you understand it's totally appropriate that they put their family first. But it makes it hard to schedule time with friends. And the great thing about Orthodox Judaism is that it just continually brings you together, right, for scheduled prayer. So even if you are not someone who particularly enjoys prayer, ritualized prayer, that's me, and I particularly enjoy ritualized prayer, but I love that Orthodox Judaism brings us together, and having a framework of organized prayer going on, it elevates the interaction. So you get high, even if you're not praying, you get high off other people's supply. It's like there's this place that you can go 3 times a day, and if it works for you, right, you can get a hit of other people's, right, spiritual cocaine. You can get a bump from it. It's hard to leave davening or Torah study and not be elevated by the experience. And that's where you'll likely see your married friends with kids, right? You don't think they want to get out of the house. You don't think that they want to be away from screaming, demanding children at times, right? They go to davening, right? They go to shul, they go to Torah study, and it's a great opportunity to see your friends. Because it can get really tiring to schedule and reschedule with people who've got many other things going on. And I'm not the most flexible person, so I particularly find it annoying. So when you have regular things that you do, such as yoga or a book club or an exercise routine or a volunteering commitment or the regularized, ritualized practice of religion, right, that brings you together, and you don't have to schedule it, right? You just have to show up, and they're your friends. And friends are the one of those things that's hard to optimize in life, because you have to put up with a lot of tedium when you socialize and spend time with other people. There's a lot of tedium, and then suddenly you get the gold, and you don't know when the gold's coming in social interactions. So big debate tomorrow night, and I think we know how Kamala Harris will do. She'll have practiced lines, rehearsed lines, and so she's going to come across with some zingers and some rehearsed lines, and Donald Trump's going to be a wild card. So Trump certainly seems to have ADHD. I sure hope he takes his Adderall, because if he simply does even in this debate, right, he should be in a good place. Because the latest New York Times poll, which is a highly respected poll, places him up 1 against Kamala Harris nationally. And Democrats really need to be up 4 nationally due to Republican advantages in the Electoral College. So the sugar high of the Kamala Harris campaign is definitely over. So this book by Gregory Zuckerman about Robert Mercer, and I think it's the Magellan Fund. It talks about a history of hedge funds. Peter Lynch ran Fidelity. from 1977 to 1990, and the Fidelity Magellan Fund was a particular outstanding winner during that time. And the book discusses various systems used by hedge funds and how this one hedge fund that Mercer joined has just made more money than any other hedge fund. It's just outstanding rates of return with relatively few employees. I think they have something like 200 employees, and they're making far more money than hedge funds with 2,000 employees. So I probably read 20 books of nonfiction for every book of fiction. So I love a good narrative work of nonfiction, like these two books on hedge funds. Right? You get the pleasure of the novel, but you feel like you're learning something real. But I am reading a rare novel that's called The Material, a novel by a woman from France who moved to the United States, and it's about an MFA program in stand-up comedy. So much fun to read, such sharp observations. And normally you can tell when a book's written by a man and a woman. Men and women have different observations. There aren't many male writers who develop a female writer, a female character. Ooh, so narcissism. Right, it changed my life when I got the narcissistic personality diagnosis in April of 2000. But that was just one psychiatrist's opinion. I had another psychiatrist said, I don't think you've got narcissistic personality disorder. And it's interesting, if I just take the Adderall, many of my tendencies toward narcissism and self-aggrandizement they diminish because they're just stimulus seeking. But when I have my Adderall, I'm not seeking stimuli. So it's amazing how just taking a medication can hold in check what would otherwise come across to many mental health professionals as a personality disorder, for which the general consensus is there is no cure. One of the most useful things I learned about narcissism years ago was in a book by a psychologist at Harvard who made the point that narcissism is usually situational, that narcissism is usually a situational strategy rather than a condition. Right, there are times and places where it's appropriate to seek attention, but there are adaptive and maladaptive ways to do it. So anyway, Saturday night, after Shabbat, I click onto the platform X, and two of my favorite people are talking about me. Elliot Blatt there was having a conversation with Curious Gazelle, and I tuned in briefly, and I thought, nah, I don't need more narcissistic supply right now. I got other priorities for my Saturday night. Let me just put that aside. So I remember as a journalist, one of the greatest joys was dealing with people who had some detachment, right, who weren't particularly needy for what you were going to say about them. You admired and you liked and you felt relaxed around people who had some detachment with regard to what you're going to write about them. And so I remember interviewing a regular writer for the New Yorker. I think he wrote a book about a conservative rabbi. And he made the point that he knew this conservative rabbi, who generally received an admiring portrait in the book. He knew that this conservative rabbi was going to read every single word in this book about him. And he'd also had the experience of, spending time with spiritual leaders in other religions and any other sense from any of them, they were not even going to read what he wrote. They were that detached. So there are big differences between peoples in how they respond to praise. Right? Generally speaking, I've noticed Jews like to feel good about themselves. Jews generally have pretty high self-esteem, a great amount of confidence in their own abilities. And if you give a Jew a compliment, as Dennis Prager knows, he'll often say thank you and ask for another one, right? While if you give a Protestant a compliment, he'll often say, oh, it's not me, I'm a sinner. So to me, the Jewish approach seems more authentic, more human, more passionate, more emotionally intense. So from a Jewish perspective, Protestants, in their self-denial, they seem fake. While from a Protestant perspective, Jews seem carnal and just, a victim of the earthly passions. But it is a beautiful quality in people that they have a sense of detachment. Like we had Kip on the show regularly over the past few weeks, and one of the joys of having Kip on the show is that he is not super sensitive, right? I feel like I can say anything to Kip and I don't have to worry about how he'll handle it, but he'll handle it on his own 2 feet. He's not going to get a strong emotional reaction. He's not going to give my comment disproportionate power. While other people I have on my show, and I know I have to be very careful with what I say to them because it can just set them off. And so it's a real pleasure dealing with people who have a sense of detachment, who don't put too much importance on your words, on your actions, right? So let's say you and I are scheduled to meet for coffee, but something might come up for me and I might only be able to give you an hour's notice, right? A sense of detachment that I recognize that you have other things going on in your life, I have other things going on in my life, and sometimes something else will come up for either of us that supersedes our coffee appointment. And it's hard for people to work together as pairs, right? Because it's very intense hosting a radio show or live stream. But it makes it much easier when each party has a sense of detachment, when they don't take overly seriously the other person's comments or actions. Because we'll often excuse our own behavior by saying, I understood my intentions. I was rude that day because I was worried about my mother, or I was having back pain or dental pain, right? And so we excuse our own behavior because we recognize what was driving us. But then when other people behave badly, right, we don't tend to give them the same grace. Right? We tend to attribute, they're just a bad person. So when we behave badly, we usually have excuses for it. If we don't have an excuse for it, we can say, that's not reflective of who I am overall. It's just a bad situation, a bad interaction. I made a bad mistake, but that's not who I am. But when other people do the same thing, we'll very typically go, that person's just a liar. That person's just useless. So I'm challenged by an essay I read last week about the mental health crisis on the left, how liberalism predisposes people to unhappiness and to mental health problems. Because in my perhaps overreaction to right-wing talk radio, which tends to portray Republicans and conservatives as solid, good, decent, hardworking, patriotic Americans who you can count on, who are not duplicitous, right? And my experience with many wonderful atheists who are not conservative, not Republican, but just wonderful people, just highly impressive. And so I came out of that experience with the perspective that just because someone's on the left or the right doesn't make them more or less likely to tell the truth or to be a good neighbor, to be honest, to be decent, to be a good neighbor. But thinking about that essay that I read last week by Mustafa, political ideology can affect your mental health, and people with mental health problems are more likely to treat you differently. So the more educated the person, particularly the minority, right, the more likely they are to see racism and sexism and ageism and homophobia and all these other perils of the liberal hero system. Right? The college-educated minority is much more likely to attribute an unhappy interaction to things such as racism and sexism and heteronormativity and the like. And that does accord with my life experience. Also, people on the left are much more likely to be politically active. And so I've had mixed real life relations with people on the left in the workplace who are politically active. So I've often had the experience where everything outside of politics is perfectly pleasant. And it's just in the realm of the political, they become insane. But their politics does affect them to the extent that they can become bedridden after someone such as Donald Trump wins an election. So we already have a significant mental health crisis on the left. And it's just going to explode if Donald Trump wins this election. So who are the longest running live stream co-hosts? Right? Who have been able to work together for years and years and years? So I was just reading an article in The Atlantic, I think by a psychiatrist, on the virtues of distraction, that too much intensity can drive people apart. And so I think the psychiatrist mentioned his patient was incredibly despondent, and so he got the radical idea of having their session meet outside and to go for a walk. And then through the distraction of going through a walk, then the patient was able to open up. And yeah, there has been a big change in the way that mental health professionals talk about their clients, right? They used to be patients, now they're clients. Because in part, people now seek out mental health professionals, not just for when they're sick and they have some horrible thing operating and destroying their life, but also just to be happier, to be more effective if they're having some bumps in their marriage or in their work or with their friends, or they're feeling unsatisfied. So I noticed a lot of people using medicine, mental health professionals now, just to optimize. But the point of this psychiatrist's essay was that we often benefit from some distraction. So we think different thoughts when we're walking as opposed to when we're sitting down. Right? There are all these stimuli around me which will open up different thoughts than if I was just sitting looking at a computer screen. And so I do notice that with many relationships, right, once they get too intense, they burn out. And co-hosting a show together is incredibly intense. But if you're able to maintain some distractions, say you're at a sports bar, you're just watching football. Trump and Kamala set to debate in the first city in the country to fluoridate the water supply, Grand Rapids, Michigan. Speaking of mental health crises. So count me as skeptical that fluoridation of water is a major problem of ill health. I am not a fan of Robert Kennedy. I can't stand the anti-vax movement. Getting vaxxed is probably the simplest, most effective thing that anyone can do for their health, while losing weight and keeping it off is incredibly difficult. So I notice many of my alternative health friends during COVID said, well, why isn't the government telling people to exercise more and to lose weight? That'll do more for them than getting vaccinated. Well, getting vaccinated is easy. Losing weight and keeping weight off is incredibly difficult. Getting people to exercise more than they currently exercise is usually quite difficult. Getting people to make substantial lifestyle changes is very difficult. So the more difficult something is, right, the less likely people are to do it. So walking with friends is awesome. Right? There's some distraction, right? It takes the edge off of what could otherwise be an overly intense interaction. So I love walking. I love walking with friends, and there is a democratic and egalitarian element to Orthodox Judaism in that pretty much everyone walks to shul and then walks from shul, while at a non-Orthodox synagogue, pretty much everyone drives. And then they drive, vastly different types of cars, right? You've got Mercedes and Ferraris and Teslas, and then you've got low-end models too. And it reminds you of how egalitarian your lives are. But when you're all walking to shul and from shul, there's this feeling of camaraderie that you're all in it together. You're all facing the same limitations. And one of the benefits of painful rituals, right, such as fasting, is that it brings people together. Right, so Yom Kippur, Tisha B'Av, there are approximately 5 fast days in the Jewish calendar, and you're all suffering together, which bonds you, makes you closer. So when you share a pain, it's like the pain is halved, and when you share a joy, it's like the joy is doubled. And so when you interact with friends at shul and a walk, right, there are distractions. It takes us a lot of the edge off the intensity. You have a sense of a common project. And the conversation will go in unexpected ways because it's a porous interaction as opposed to an interaction in a bubble. Right? Talking to people on Zoom is so tiring compared to talking with people when you're out for a walk. Group e-scootering is better than group walking. It's also incredibly dangerous. When I'm on Venice Beach, I can't believe how many people are not wearing helmets. Right? It seems like 90% of the people roller skating and biking and scooting around Venice Beach are not wearing helmets. That's crazy. Now, I never wore a helmet as a kid, and I don't think any of the other kids I knew wore a helmet when biking. But now we know better. And so taking prudent measures to ensure one's own safety seems like a wise thing to do.